My name is Allison Van Dyke, and I'm the Executive Director and Chair of the Temple of Understanding. And I want to welcome you all this morning, or this evening, depending on where you live, to the Eco Justice for All dialogue series. Our topic today is the urgency of the ecological crisis, a Buddhist and Hindu perspective. This series is an ongoing program of the Temple of Understanding, a 61-year-old interfaith organization whose mission is to bring world religious leaders and actors together to address major problems facing the world today. Our focus for the past 11 years has been on climate change and environmental awareness and advocacy, both in our youth programs and in our adult program, and as an NGO at the United Nations. Our guest speakers today are David R. Loy, a professor of Buddhist and comparative philosophy, a writer and teacher in the Sanbo Zen tradition of Japanese Buddhism. His most recent book, Ecodharma, Buddhist Teachings for the Ecological Crisis, is wonderful, and I totally recommend it. I loved it. He's also one of the founders of the Rocky Mountain Ecodharma Retreat Center near Boulder, Colorado, where he lives. Our next presenter is Rajesh Purohit, who works with the Hindu Climate Action in Oxford, UK. He lives in London, I believe. And his day job is with analytics and automation industry. He teaches and writes about Hinduism and how to implement the divine thoughts of the ancient masters or rishis in one's daily life. Rajesh believes that the unity of Hinduism, to see the world as one family, is an important philosophical stance for the future. I want to thank our honored guests for being here, and I want to open the floor to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison, for that warm introduction, and thank you also for this opportunity. Frankly, it's the first time that I've had an opportunity to have a dialogue with somebody within and representing the Hindu tradition. All the more interesting because, of course, from the beginning, Hinduism and Buddhism have been intertwined within India. So I'm sure we have a lot to talk about. I would like to start us off just by alluding to something I read last year by Noam Chomsky, the well-known author and critic, who said that this is the most dangerous moment ever in human history. And he wasn't just alluding to the climate crisis or the ecological challenge, but nonetheless, that's what he highlighted. And I think that's something we all have a sense of, that this is very, very dangerous in the sense that what we do or don't do in the next few years is going to have enormous repercussions. And so the question that comes out of that, of course, is, given that, how do our spiritual traditions respond appropriately to that sort of challenge? So let me just open things up by turning to Rajesh and asking you, what does the Hindu tradition have to offer that can help us understand and respond to this extraordinary challenge?
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction, and just echoing David's words. And again, thanks for that lovely question to start off this, what should I dare to say, this dynamic conversation that we're going to have. So I want to start by just touching on what Alison said, and I think the inherent values of the Hindu tradition exist and are based on the values of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, that idea of the world being that one family, the world being that one essence that exists, and we see that world as not indifferent. In fact, it's within us. And one thing that Hinduism has taught from the very beginning, in fact, in one of the first Vedas, that one of our scriptures that existed, it's actually taught that the environment, the essence of the environment, is not separate from one. In fact, it's within us. It's inherent. It's within our bodies. We live because of the energy of that environment. Now, just to contemplate on that for a second, you can get that value and the understanding of how important the environment then is, and ecologically how our existence is in flow with the environment in itself. And hence why I would say that spiritually our values are so grounded that we don't see the environment and our values as indifferent. In fact, they're exactly the same. They're inherent within one another. And then values, if I was just to highlight one or two, the values of dharma being the foundation of everything we speak from, that righteousness of duty that exists within one and what one should do, that idea of knowing what is right and knowing what is wrong, the values of dharma that exist, the values of compassion, which are inherent, compassion to not just oneself, but also everyone around them. And then there's also the idea of that non-harm, the ahimsa value of not hurting one another. But when it comes to not hurting one another, Hinduism believes that everything, in fact, every mere morsel of everything that exists within the world is living. And because it's living, if you want to harm it, it's against the value and principle of what we believe. So they're just a few highlights. But what I would love to hear and certainly know more about is what your take, David, is on Buddhism linking in with this ecological crisis, and how you would found and understand, say, the top 3 values that you would put in line with the Buddhist values.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that you use the word dharma, because, as I'm sure you know, we have exactly the same term within Buddhism, right? The term dharma refers initially to the teachings of the Buddha, but also more generally just to the way things are. And I'm also struck by the parallel with your emphasis on the oneness of everything within Hinduism. One of the essential Buddhist teachings is the denial of a separate self. You know, we all have this sense of a me, and for the most part, we feel separate from other people, that our well-being is separate from other people. And one of the really essential teachings is overcoming that, realizing not only our interdependence, but our sort of non-duality. And one of the striking things about the ecological crisis is that it seems to be a larger version of the same kind of challenge. If the challenge is overcoming the delusion of a separate self, it seems like we have this collective species or civilizational challenge of overcoming the delusion that our species, our culture is separate from the rest of the earth. Because it really seems to me that goes to the heart of the issue. It's not simply, we don't simply have a climate crisis where we're emitting too much carbon into the atmosphere. That's just the tip of a much larger ecological crisis, including things like many different types of pollution and loss of biodiversity, et cetera, all of which ultimately comes back, I think, to this ultimate problem. And I expect we're going to agree it's a spiritual problem of duality, that we collectively feel separate from the earth, and therefore that the response, the appropriate response that's necessary is not just technological or economic or political, but in some sense it also has to be spiritual, in the sense that it really challenges us to look at how we understand the relationship between ourselves and other people, but also us collectively and the rest of the natural world. I don't know if I've responded adequately to your question, Rajesh, but I think I'll turn it over to you to say more about what the Hindu perspective would be on the kind of issue that I mentioned.
Yeah, certainly. Not just adequately answered. In fact, gone into great detail, I would say, David. So thank you very much for that. In terms of the whole Hindu foundation, and I think again linking in with what you said, that whole duality perspective, as you may also know, that Hinduism has many different schools of thought that exist within Hinduism. The whole idea of different pathways is the best way I would put it, which teaches different levels of philosophy, and within that, I think innately exists a whole positive field of understanding, because you're not bound by the shackles of saying that do this and that's right, or do this and that's wrong, and that's the whole positivity and the lens that Hinduism takes, I believe, on everything. It should I say, it propagates in essence, because you don't just take this path and you are the one. You're not boxed in as such. It's not something that you have to stick with. And I think that's the true benefits of the Hindu faith itself, and hence why even the ecological crisis, you could speak to someone who's Hindu and they have many different lenses, but the actual whole lens goes to that one essence, which I always come back to. And that's why we consider the world as one family, because even though there's a massive amounts of and different philosophies and schools of thought, in fact, that one essence is what exists, and we're all trying to drive towards that one benefit. And in this case, be it the environment and benefiting the environment. And I think what you said is absolutely brilliant and spot on. In fact, as spirituality has to be the foundation of us trying to overcome and also understand, and that's really important, understanding our relationship with one another and the environment as such. And I think if we can understand that, that is when we will see the benefit and impact the environment actually has on the bigger picture of what we're trying to achieve. Which comes to my question to you, David, is this whole idea and the whole importance of the relationship with the environment. But again, we know there's a massive climate emergency. And we know that if we don't make change today, we don't make change soon, we are going to face devastating catastrophes within the environment. So if I was to ask you a question, yes, it's about spirituality, but what can we do? What can we do proactively to really help that, whether it's through our faith or through our understanding? How can we really wrap that essence up, in essence?
That's the really important question, isn't it, Rajesh? Maybe I can just go back just first a little bit to what you were saying earlier about the unity of the Hindu tradition, the fact that it's a kind of unity of many different sub-traditions, whatever we want to call it. And just to emphasize that the same thing is true in Buddhism. We talk about Buddhism, we have this word, and the danger of it is that we assume it refers to one thing. And of course, the Buddhist tradition, having spread so many places in Asia and now in the modern world, it too is composed of many different traditions that share many things, but occasionally there are significant differences between them. I don't see significant differences in terms of their attitude toward the environment, toward the ecological crisis, however. But getting back to your specific question, frankly, the Buddha lived in a very different time and place, right? 2,400 years ago. And so it's not simply a matter of turning, say, to the earliest texts, the Pali Canon or some of the other sutras, and sort of reading off what is it that we can do. So it's really a matter of understanding the teachings more generally and what are the implications? What do they seem to imply about what we should do? And frankly, for me personally, I think it's pretty clear that the single most important thing that the Buddhist traditions have to offer is what's often called the Bodhisattva Path. And it's the idea that, when we're on our spiritual search, our spiritual quest, when we're on the path, we're not simply doing it for our own salvation or enlightenment or serenity, that we also realize that it's also something that involves concern for the well-being of others. So there's two sides to the Bodhisattva path. One continues one's own practice, personal practice, but also realizes that as we mature and begin to see through the delusion of separation, we naturally want to become more engaged and more involved with the world. And I think that that essential teaching, the realization that the spiritual path should not be understood as simply applying to our own sort of selves, our own separate selves, that what we're looking for is separate, but that it involves some kind of engagement with the world. I think that's just so critical, in fact, absolutely essential today. Now, of course, how that's understood within the Asian tradition, uh, frankly, none of the Asian Buddhist cultures was democratic, so the abilities to influence the political and economic process were always quite limited. What I mean by that is that Buddhism has always talked about greed, ill will, delusion. They've tended to understand it on the individual level. And now I think it's clear we need to look at the kind of structural or institutional forms that that can take. For me personally, frankly, the need of our economic system to keep growing indefinitely, that can be understood as a kind of greed. You know, you never have enough. What I'm trying to say here is that it's clear that to be a Buddhist practitioner today, as I understand it, is also to be concerned about what is happening ecologically, and therefore finding ways. And maybe we can talk a bit later about how one finds one's own way, but that becomes absolutely essential to one's own personal transformation and personal spiritual progress. Yeah. Would it be something like that in the, I mean, does that resonate with you within the Hindu tradition? How would you see it as
I certainly think so, David. Just as you were talking, there was certain things popping into my mind that really do have such a comparison, which actually link together very well with our faith, because I almost find it's that inner that inward thought process. The whole idea of Hinduism also links to three things, which is shravan, to listen, to spend a lot of time listening, and whether that's listening to a discourse or whether that's reading or that type of understanding, to listen. And then we go on to the second, which is manan, to contemplate, to really think about what you've listened to, what you've read, and try and understand that and imbibe that as an understanding. And then it goes on to the idea of nididhyasan, the idea of action. You know, take that and develop that into your day-to-day life. And just what you mentioned was phenomenal in terms of the way it links to that, is actually what you're saying is go through that process, of finding yourself through that journey. And I find Hinduism is very much that. It's find oneself to then help others, and once you have an understanding of that wisdom that exists, and that real fire of wisdom that exists, you can then be able to impart that and pass that on. And in essence, that's what our spiritual scientists in Hinduism did. They spent a lot of time contemplating, a lot of time understanding, and then living that life, and then actually going on and saying, this is the life that we've led. And you go, and for me, I go back to that day and age. And I know you mentioned that it's a very different time, place, and circumstance that exists now. But when you go back to that day and age, you see there was a lot less want, and more, we will be sufficient with what our needs are. And, you know, I always take an example that our spiritual scientists lived off eating leaves. By no means am I saying that we should do that now. That would be nigh on impossible. But I see that there is a very, very stark contrast in the way we live now, and that it's what do we want next? You know, it's just like we earn money or we earn wealth or we have food. We always want the next indulgence, should I say? And you know, it's common in all our lives that, you know, if we get a cheesecake on the table, we always want something else after that, you know, a cup of tea or whatever it may be. And I think that's exactly what it is. It's what comes next. And I think you tapped into that so beautifully, David, that actually, and how it links directly into our Hindu values in itself. What I would like to ask David is, and this is a question that I know is always a difficult one, but that attachment, that desire, that sense of want, Now, I think we're going on to the question of the path in itself, but how does one not suppress that, but curb that, should I say, curb that excess understanding and be able to take the enlightened path of understanding?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. I think we're really getting down to it. Thank you for that question. Yeah. Starting from what you were saying earlier about the difference between the needs that people satisfied some 2,500 years ago and what we're doing today, frankly, Rajesh, it seems to me that the most popular, successful religion of the modern era is consumerism, right? I mean, if we understand consumerism as teaching us, what's really important about the world and how to live in it, I think that's the main one going. And of course, it's the proselytizing is all about all the advertising, right? So consumerism keeps persuading us that the next thing we buy is going to make us happy, and we get stuck in that kind of cycle. And as we both know, all genuine religious traditions, I think, really offer a way out of that. Yeah. In 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 the Buddhist terms that I often use, I would say it's something like this. I've already mentioned that for Buddhism, the the sense of a separate self is a delusion, right? Not only a delusion, but in many ways the most problematical one, causing the most suffering. And in more modern language, I think we can understand that as saying that the sense of self, that's something babies aren't born with. It's a psychological and social construct. It's we learn to experience ourselves in a certain kind of way, and because it's a construct, it's inherently insecure. That is to say, it has no separate reality. It's more a collection of functions, sort of habitual ways of thinking and feeling and acting and how they work together. Uh, but because it doesn't have any reality, this sense of separate self, it's basically inherently insecure, inherently anxious. And I think we experience that as a sense of lack, as the sense that something is wrong with me, something is missing, I'm not good enough, whatever. And I think that's the real origin of consumerism, the kind of consumerist cultures that, just about all of us live in today encourage us to understand our sense of lack as something out there that we're lacking. We don't have enough money, we don't have enough consumer toys, whatever. And so the whole point, and in many ways, I think the fundamental origin of the problem is we're thinking the way to become happy, the way to fill up this sense of lack, this sort of bottomless pit at the core of our being, is to get stuff, is to get enough stuff, and it can't possibly do it. So this is a long way of answering your question, that we need to see through that as a delusion of self and realize that it doesn't really make us happy. I'm going on a bit here, but let me just mention one other thing that I think is so important, which is that there have been all these fascinating studies just in the last decade or so, not only by psychologists, but economists, sociologists. And basically, they've been studying about what makes people happy. And what they're realizing is it ain't stuff. It's not consumerism. It's the quality of our relationships with other people. And I just find that so, it's like, why aren't we preaching that? Why isn't that emphasized in every school class? What a difference that would make, and how important it is to sort of stress that. Yeah. Anyway, apologies for that long response, but let me turn it back to you in terms of the Buddhist, in terms of the Hindu traditions. What would you focus on in terms of specifically what we might do?
Yeah, again, super inspiring, David. Could feel the passion coming through, which is phenomenal. And I think again, a lot of that resonates and resonates within what we believe. And I think it's arguably not the suppression of trying to say, what we're never going to be able to do is completely remove attachment or completely remove desire, and I find that almost our faith never says that. In fact, it says, earn as much as you want, because we have the dharma, then we have earth, which means to earn. Then we have kam, that sense of desire. Actually, it's there. It's saying we know it's here. But what it's actually saying is make sure it's directed in the right way. And I almost find that's the whole idea of finding your journey, finding one's path, because it's the direction. Just as in Buddhism, you have your spiritual masters who take your hand and take you down a journey to understand. And similarly with that, within ours, we see our spiritual masters who take us down that journey. And I think the key is that it's never shunted as something that's wrong, because we've understood through decades of this journey of spiritual understanding that actually earning and to earn money and to earn as much as you want is great, but don't forget the foundation of why you've earned. The foundation of actually earning is to give back, and that's the key. Because if I was to sum up Hinduism in a nutshell, I would, dare I say this, but I would say it's giving is living. The idea of to live is to give. And how much, rather than, and it's just a simple concept, rather than getting a present, you rip it open, you're so excited, it lasts about 2 minutes. We all know that. But then when you give something and you see a smile on someone's face, it lasts forever. And I think it's exactly that idea of, if we can give back to Mother Earth, how much more supplemented would Mother Earth be? How much more different would a Mother Earth be? I recently read a study where, which was phenomenal, which it said if human existence was to pause and stop creating such an impact on Mother Earth, then within a number of years, Mother Earth would repair herself. And I think, that's just a phenomenal understanding to ourselves, to say, what are we doing that's negative and what are we doing that's positive? It's kind of balancing that out. And I would never say that don't have any desire. If nobody had any desire, we wouldn't have the GDP or the capita going around, the world. But what I would say is, I think it's that direction of focus. Where is your desire leading you on the path of spirituality? Because almost, and I want to lead this question back to you, David, because I feel like there's a lot of similarities, but it's almost an incremental process. And this is the way I see it, as an incremental journey. You can't reach a state of wisdom by just peeking your head above the door and saying, I'm here. It's a very rugged process, and through that process, sometimes you could falter or you could get lost. And my question to you is, within Buddhism, how does one stay focused on that goal, on that vision of that journey?
Thank you for that. Yes. First of all, let me just mention briefly what you said about, say, earning money. The Buddha said exactly the same thing in the Pali Canon. It's interesting. It's like the Buddha isn't encouraging material poverty. Basically, what he says is it's okay to have money. The important issues are, number one, how did you earn it? And number two, how do you use it? So it's not as though Buddhism is just because monastics live a very simple life, it's not to say that somehow, it's not saying that desires are, those kinds of desires for comfort are inherently bad or anything like that, right? I also really appreciate what, I think you use the word gift, which evokes something important for me, because when we look at our spiritual traditions, I see an interesting contrast between an exchange economy, which is the main economy we have, but what might also be used, what might also be called a gift economy. And in a way, we know that both of our traditions emphasize this gift as a sense of appreciation. And that, to me, resonates in a number of different ways. One of them is the fact that when we consider, say, our ecological crisis, sometimes it's difficult not to become very cynical or very despondent. And we tend to wonder what it is that we can do might make a difference. And one of the really important things in the Mahayana, in the Bodhisattva tradition or path, is non-attachment to the results of one's actions. In other words, I think today in modern terms, we are encouraged to do the very best that we can, but also recognizing that ultimately what comes out of that, we don't know. We don't know if it'll have any impact whatsoever, and that's okay. And in other words, what we need to do now is our gift to the earth. Gift in the sense that, like you said, a genuine gift, you don't expect something in return. It's not really a gift, that's exchange, right? But a genuine gift, you give it freely without expectation of return. And I think that's the kind of fundamental challenge that all our spiritual traditions can help us with. Because I think it's very hard to do that unless we're grounded in some kind of contemplative, meditative, spiritual practice that can help us do that. And of course, I'm immediately thinking of the Bhagavad Gita and the karma yoga that Krishna talked about. Maybe I should open that up to you, and you can say something about that. But it seems to me this really goes to the heart of how it is that we are motivated and what we can do there.
Yeah, you just touched on again multiple thoughts that exist within the pantheon of Hinduism too, and touching on the Bhagavad Gita, two beautiful teachings that came to my mind is when Shri Krishna says to Arjuna, because it's a whole dialogue between them throughout, and when he says to Arjuna is tasmat sarveshu kareshu mam anusmara yudhyacha, when he says to him, no, get up and fight. And his whole concept of saying to him, stand up and fight for that righteous duty, fight for that righteous action, fight for the righteous nature of all that are behind you. And it's the idea again of removing you from the situation. It's no longer you're fighting for yourself, you're actually fighting for mankind as at large. And by no means am I saying is it an unrighteous fight? Where there's a righteous fight and there's a righteous voice, that's where you then get that sense of wisdom, that understanding, that development. And that's exactly what happened on the battlefield within the Bhagavad Gita, is there was wisdom given to Arjuna, in which he then understood what he needed to do. And it's that exact action, to take that action, to summarize that action and then do, is really what the essence of the Bhagavad Gita is. And one thing you touched on, which really got me, David, was the whole idea of to renounce them desires for the fruit without any fruits, and that's exactly what the Bhagavad Gita is all about. You know, in the Bhagavad Gita it says karmanyevadhikaraste ma phaleshu kadachana, meaning that, hey, you've done all this, but not for wanting something back, not for the idea of, if I do this, I'm going to get something back from you. I've given you a PlayStation, I want a PlayStation back, or I want something more. It's not the idea. In fact, we're moving away from a transactional relationship with the Supreme to a more invested relationship with the Supreme, where we see everything we put in as an investment. And when we look at the bigger picture, when we put in an investment, we are no longer looking at the return. All it is the values totting up, and it's going up and up and up. And that's exactly the whole karma, the whole idea of your punya karma and your pap karma, meaning that which is good and that which is bad. You know, it's all about weighing the scales and making sure that your good is higher. And I think almost, you know, what you said was phenomenal, David, in terms of renouncing that. And that's when I almost feel that the enlightened path actually starts, as soon as you start renouncing these real fruits that actually are only giving you material wealth. So I think that was really phenomenal. What I do want to really understand about the Buddhist crux of that area is, as you've been on this journey for many years, David, in fact, arguably longer than me,
that's definitely what you're saying, right, Rajesh?
Sorry, but you're a real scholar in terms of really that essence of Buddhism. And what I wanted to understand is just as you know, in Buddhism, the whole idea of your body is the temple of all being, and it is the being of existence that radiates out. What would you say really on the path of Buddhism is a key thing that one needs to do? You know, i.e., like for example, meditation, I know, is a big part of that understanding, but what can or what does one need to do to really found themselves in the faith itself?
Great. Maybe I can give two quick, or try to make them two quick answers to that. One of them is to sort of reinforce something I tried to say before, to the effect that, you know, the person who benefits most from the Bodhisattva activity is the Bodhisattva herself or himself, in the sense that, you know, putting it in Buddhist terms, when we practice, when we have some insight, it doesn't mean that we automatically are transformed, not deeply enough. The habits, the old self-centered habits tend to be there. How do we really transform those habits and integrate what we realize into how we actually live and relate to other people? And that requires the activity, that requires the Bodhisattva activity. In other words, the activity of helping other people becomes an essential part of our practice, you know. The other and in that sense, they're not two practices, they're just two sides of the same coin. You know, the other thing that you evoke in me is, as a result of this new Ecodharma Center we've started and the book that I wrote, I do occasionally get questions from people who say, you know, I really want to be socially engaged. I'm a Buddhist practitioner. But I don't know, what should I do? What should I do? And the irony, of course, is that, well, everyone's situation is different. I can't really tell you. So what I want to mention is kind of a three-part meditation that I've started suggesting, and I've personally found it helpful, and others as well, to help us answer for ourselves what that question might be. And it's something that I think shouldn't be done too quickly. There's the three parts. One should dwell on each. Basically, it involves, what do I have to offer? Looking, you know, in a lot of ways, it'll be the same as everyone else, but I have my own individual, each of us has our own individual qualities, education, experience, health, age, etc., etc. Secondly, what are the good possibilities for me? Because there's so much to do, isn't there, Rajesh? I mean, my goodness, it's like we can spread ourselves so thin, it doesn't make any difference, and just spend all our time signing online petitions, right? Not going to take us very far. So what are the real options? What are the good options for me? And finally, having digested those two, as it were, putting them on the side and kind of going deep inside. And this is going deeper than the ego, letting go of the ego and going deeper and say, where does my love, where does the love want to go? What tugs at my heart? And, you know, it's not an ego separate self heart. It's more, what is there of the divine? Opening up to that divine, however we want to describe it. Where does the divine want us to devote our energies? Because more and more, given the enormity of the ecological crisis, I think the divine is basically asking all of us, please become ecosattvas, please do what you can. And I think that's how we can find whether, you know, what it is that we might contribute. And maybe I can just turn this back to you. And my guess is, again, this is evoking some things within the Hindu tradition. So why don't I just open it up to you, Rajesh, and see where you want to take it?
Yeah, most certainly. You hit the nail on the head. And I think one thing that really hit me was the whole ego and the whole that what we call in our tradition ahankar, the ego, which can really ruin one in terms of actually switching the path of goodness and the path of none, because, you know, as soon as the way I look at it, and you know, it's you know, the standing tall I, to remove the standing tall I and drop that into a bridge format of a H and walk across that bridge is when, you know, you've let go of the ego, because you've let go of the shackles of saying, I'm now doing this, I'm now carrying this out. You know, you've then understood that it's a higher self speaking to you, and I think that's a phenomenal place to be. And I think another thing you really related to for me is how, if you really spread yourself thin, you can get lost. And I think that's so important. You know, the vastness of Buddhism and the vastness of Hinduism as traditions, you know, the schools of thought, the vastness of the text that exists, the vastness of the traditions, the vastness of the practices that exist. You know, if you went to go do every single one of them, you'd be there for a whole lifetime itself, and you'd understand nothing, because it's that rich in its understanding that it can really, I feel, you can get lost in the jungle of that understanding. And I find it's really key what you mentioned about having a focus, and if I was to shed any light on that focus, as you've mentioned, meditation being a key for Buddhism, and having that understanding to ask yourself them questions and really dig deep. And I think for me, it's the same, you know, in our spirituality, it's all about listening to oneself and understanding oneself. And I think the first path is really to understand what our scholars are saying to us. You know, what are they trying to unwrap and say to us, and just spending some time contemplating on that, listening and listening to that, reading texts that you feel resonate with you. And almost in essence, it doesn't have to be a really heavy spiritual text. It can be a text exactly just as you've written, David, the Ecodharma text, you know, because it resonates more with oneself, and people can have a more expansive understanding. And I think there is certainly a journey, and that journey, you know, is not like a trampoline where you jump on it and you end up so high that you know, it's all, yeah, I've reached. It's more of a journey where you take an incremental stepping stone to that sense of understanding, that sense of development, that place that then brings you. And I think a key thing for Hinduism is that inner contentment. It brings you in a peace, it brings you in a contentment. And, you know, it's a very hard place to be, let's face it. You know, it takes a lifetime to get there. And I'm going to argue, I'm certainly, you know, getting there, you know, because it's a journey. And I almost find that it's a journey that is one that, just like a gift, you know, you unwrap it and you go through it. And I think that's really the essence of where we want to be. And I know Buddhism has very similar comparisons to taking that journey of peace, and hence the idea of meditation, you know, sitting to understand oneself and really dig deep. And that really resonated with me. That was phenomenal, David. And thank you for sharing such lovely thoughts. I'd like to ask just maybe a last question to you, David, on this is, if I was to say how, and this may be a very difficult question, if I was to say in maybe one line or however you feel comfortable, how would you sum up Buddhism's values towards the environment?
Yeah, that's interesting to try to sum up in one line. I guess what I would focus on is what I mentioned earlier about non-duality. It's, you know, it's the earth isn't just a place where we happen to live, right? It's our mother. And we never cut the umbilical cord, despite the fantasies of people who want to go terraform Mars and all that kind of stuff. It's like, you know, we are manifestations, expressions of the earth, and we need to appreciate that. We need to take care of our mother as we would be expected, as we would hope to take care of our own personal mother. But we also need to ask the earth, especially at this point, you know, it's like in the Buddhist tradition, there's so much stress upon, you know, and Hindu, both of our traditions, I think, are wonderful on this, getting beyond the sense of self. And but I think it just becomes more and more clear that involves embedding ourselves in our bodies, in the earth, in the ground, and feeling the responsibility that comes from that. But maybe as a way to end this part of our discussion, can I ask you the same question? How would you summarize what the Hindu traditions have to say here?
Yeah, most certainly. I think that was, again, very, very clear, and as concise as you can be with the vastness of the tradition in itself.
That's the problem with leading questions. Sorry, go ahead.
I think, I think for me the same, and I would really resonate is one thing that you picked on was Mother Earth being the mother, being the giver, and as she constantly gives, the question is, just as you have a mother who presides within your house, who presides within your homes or beyond whatever you see as a mother, you would, as she's given birth to you, you'd then, when you grow up, give back to her, give her residence, help her, support her. And similarly, I see the same. You know, the environment, Mother Earth, is no different. As just as she gives us crops, just as she gives us as much as she gives us on a daily basis, it's our turn. Our turn has now come to step up and give back, and I think that's really the key value. And I come back to just the idea of giving is living. You know, we have to step up and give, and give with an open heart, and open our hands and say, look, this is what I'm giving to you. And you know, the values of Hinduism certainly resonate with that of just attempt to give. And you know, that attempt to give is what will then spark that mental inclination to understand even further. So yeah, I think I'll hand back to you, David, to maybe take us through some of the question time, should I say.
Yes, indeed. So, yeah, thank you for that, Rajesh, first of all, very much. And maybe I'll read a question that's appeared in the chat and ask you first to respond to it. In Hinduism, there's reincarnation. In Buddhism, it's known as rebirth. How can this concept of returning to earth affect you as a Hindu or Buddhist, as compared to, say, religions or perspectives that believe life is a single experience and comes to an end, and then you go somewhere else, like heaven? In other words, could religions that believe we come back here again and again be more invested in protecting the earth? What do you think? I'll first dibs there.
Yeah, that's a really lovely question, and a very expansive question. I think that's a whole philosophy in yeah, I'm sure you can say the same, David. It's probably a whole topic of conversation we could go on to have for many hours, I reckon. But in the short, what I can say is reincarnation, Punarjanma, as it's called within Hinduism, the cycle of life and death in itself, as it's known, again, I think has steps, and them steps are dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. You know, the idea of then leaving. And I think what I would say is, firstly, to start with, it comes back to good deeds and bad deeds, and one who does good takes that journey and elevates themselves beyond that cycle of life and death. And this is what Hinduism believes, that it's to become, not go through the cycle of life and death, actually become completely detached from that cycle of life and death and achieve that supreme abode. And to do that, one has to do good deeds, good karma, good deeds.
Right.
And if one does bad deeds, in essence, then they get trapped in that cycle of life and death. And as they get trapped, they then descend back on this earth as a different form, whatever it may be. Now, I think for me, it's very clear in Hinduism that do good when you're here. You're on this earth, you're here as an individual, and in Hinduism, we strongly believe that to be given a human body is in fact a very, very, very rare thing. Mm-hmm. And because we've been given this intellectual capacity to understand, invest yourself now, invest yourself here and now, and make a difference here and now. Because who knows what you can come back as. And it's that whole idea of, before you go through that journey, in fact, try now. Why wait to go through that journey and say, oh, I might end up here, I might end up there? It's a question mark in essence, really. So I think that moves on to the latter part of the question. I'll try and be a little bit quick here, David. In essence, can you be more, can them faiths be more invested in protecting Earth? I come back to what I said. I think someone would say yes, and for me, there is a more sense of investment there. Yes, I agree. But I almost think that any faith that exists within the pantheon, currently that exists, I think has to be invested. There's no doubt. And you know, there's no question mark that we cannot be invested. I think each faith teaches its values to look after the environment, and teaches its understanding to look after the environment, whether that's in a different way, shape, or form. That's absolutely understandable. But for me, I think it's not about understanding where we go next. next. In fact, it's actually understanding what can we do here and now, and let's make that difference together now. So for me, yes, there is different ways of how one leaves and how one goes and comes back. But in short, I would say together, if we can make a difference now, we really then value the life that's to come after us.
So, yeah, thank you for that. It's interesting, again, that our traditions are intertwined enough that what you said, I mean, we may use in English a different word, rebirth, but basically the traditional idea is that we will be reborn into this world until we attain a spiritual maturity and sort of cleanse our karma to the point where we attain nibbana or nirvana. It's interesting, however, though, personally, I have a problem with the emphasis on transcendence. And I guess what I'm pointing to here, for example, in the Zen tradition that I trained in, there's no emphasis at all on ultimately transcending the world in the sense of going to another reality, right? Or a higher reality. And the problem that creates for me is that inevitably it tends to devalue this world to some extent, in the sense that this ultimately becomes a means to some higher end. And so this is actually something that I question within the Buddhist tradition. And say, as I started to say with regard to Zen, the transcendence is understood more metaphorically. The problem is the sense of separation, duality. We see the world as a collection of separate things, and then we use them, this and that, and one of those separate things that's born and dies is me. And the goal of the practice is not to transcend in the sense of go to some completely different reality, but to realize the true nature of this reality right here and now, right? And so in that sense, there's nowhere to go. And it's interesting, that clearly involves then much more of a sense, because it encourages more of an experience of non-duality and a sense of responsibility to each other and to the earth, then I can see how the ecological virtues naturally come from that, right? Taking care of the earth is taking care of our mother. It's taking care of our own essential nature. So I have to say, and in this way, I'm not being conventional Buddhist. Within the Buddhist traditions, they all talk about some ultimate reality that sort of, how it might be understood in somewhat different ways, but there is this interesting tension within the tradition that I wonder about. We have another question, if I can read it and then open it. Just this last question, we could go back and forth a lot, but given time, let me read this and ask you again what you think. Do you each have a favorite simple earth connecting practice that you could share with us? What do you think?
There's lots in all honesty, but if I was to probably narrow this down and try and pick one, and again, David, I think we can take the whole rebirth topic offline at some point, certainly. So a lovely question again, and I think a simple earth connecting practice, if I can just go back a little bit and just really give you a bit of understanding of what type of practices we actually do now that exists within Hinduism.
Please.
So I think some of the practices that exist, which I think are phenomenal, and they existed, we're talking BC years ago, and still exist now within our spiritual masters and what we do on a daily basis. We have something called Sandhyavandan, which is a morning practice, a morning spiritual practice that we do. And in that spiritual practice, we pay obeisance to Mother Earth first. That's the first thing we do. Without any means or practice, we touch Mother Earth and pay obeisance to her first. And the reason is phenomenal. The reason is because she takes our pain of us walking on her. That is literally it. So the pain that Mother Earth bears, we're asking her for forgiveness, to say, hey, Mother, I'm sorry. And we do that by touching her and saying that you're a living entity. In fact, you're no longer just this concrete that we see or these roads that you see. you're a living entity. And I think that practice, reason why it resonates with me, that is because to do that on a daily basis, or, you know, it doesn't have to be in the form of a spiritual practice. It can just be in the form of one just saying to themselves, thank you. And as simple as that, just to say thank you to Mother Earth, that practice in itself sends an absolutely different mental stimulus to one's brain throughout the day, because you're looking at your hands saying, hey, am I doing right here? Am I doing wrong? And constantly you contemplate on that thought throughout the day. And I think that idea of one having a niyam is what we call it in Hinduism, a constant practice. To take even one and have a constant practice will really fulfill and enrich one's life to then understand further. And I think that's the whole point we came to David earlier, was that sense of connection with Mother Earth is what is key. That, you know, to be an embodied being within Earth is what is really the value, because we can teach everything else, but actually that togetherness is key. But this, I can go on. So David, I'll send that back to you in terms of your thoughts.
Well, it's interesting when you look at the old sages, including the Buddha and including many of the Hindu ones, it's interesting that they had this really close connection with the natural world that for the most part we've lost, you know, like in Buddhism, right? The Buddha, when he left home, he went into the forest. He really had this connection with trees, and we see it so many other places. So I think an earth connecting practice, one really very valuable one, can actually be meditating in the natural world. And that's something that we encourage and do at our Ecodharma Center up above Boulder, that I co-teach Ecodharma retreats. And we start out, you know, we're spending, weather permitting, all our time meditating outside. And then we move into, I mean, first of all, just opening up, not sort of meditation, but sort of the mindfulness of being aware of, you know, the trees, the wildflowers, the river, et cetera, et cetera. And then we shift to gratitude. Interesting that the importance of what we call gratitude. And gratitude is a practice. It's not just something we feel or don't feel. Somebody said that, you know, we're not grateful because we're happy. We're happy because we're grateful. I just love that, you know, so cultivating gratitude is huge. And it's interesting, in our retreats, as a response, as a follow-up to that practice, then we share our grief together about what's been happening to the earth. Because I think we all have this grief and we tend to repress it. And it's really important to be able to express it and share it with other people who feel the same thing. And that, in our experience, is incredibly liberating. It really opens us up to, it kind of de-represses us, and it empowers us to sort of, okay, wow, I really want to get out there and do something. Anyway, I notice we're getting close to the end, but I think we have time just for this last question. Along with your internal practices, what gives you encouragement? Where do you find encouragement and hope today? Maybe you and I will finish with that, Rajesh.
Yeah, certainly. I think hope is the crux of all what we've discussed today, really, isn't it? In essence, I think hope is a real strength. And where do I find that hope? And I think I work with a lot of youthful people within the community currently as part of our charity, Hindu Climate Action. And one thing I can really certainly say hand on heart is that interest is growing. That interest to know, oneself. And I think, you know, the COVID crisis, I'm not going to say has been a positive one, certainly not. But what it has done is really alerted people to the value of life and the value of how just a life breath is so important. You know, we took oxygen for granted. Look how in short streams it was then supplied. And I think that value has really resonated with the youth of today. And it's something they want to know more about. They want to know more about spirituality. They want to know more about how they can go beyond themselves. And I think that key that David, you've mentioned throughout, is how to be happy in oneself, how to be content in oneself, because we still live in this life of, oh, I want the next iPhone. I want the next latest product, that's gadget that's in the market. And that's brilliant and great. But it's not sustaining our youth anymore. And they're saying, actually, we've got all this, but it's not working for me. And they really want to know. And that's one thing that I think that spark to want to know is what gives me great hope for us having a better future, a greater future, and a brighter future for not just the next generation to come, but the generation after that and generation after that. And all we can do as individuals, and I strongly believe this, is we can practice what we preach. We can practice what we read. And if we do that, people will follow in our footsteps. And I think that's key. With that, David, I know we're short on time, so I'd like to just throw the ball back to you in terms of what you find as an encouragement and hope today.
Okay, very, very briefly, because I know we're really out of time here. Actually, I don't know if it's a significant difference or just a difference in language, but in Buddhism, we don't talk about hope, actually, as somebody has said. And one way to say it is that hope is part of a duality. Hope, despair, hope, fear. There's a certain kind of future orientation. And it's really important to distinguish the grief that I think it's important for us to feel, which is something right here and now, from getting caught up in head trips about what may or may not happen in the future. So for Buddhism, there's much more emphasis on, I would say, feeling the grief, feeling the gratitude, and remembering that both of them are manifestations of love. That grief is the price we pay for love, and sort of therefore making sure we don't lose the here and now of the present in terms of acting and not knowing what's going to come of it, what may come of it. We don't know. So at least the language is, we don't talk much about hope, but we do talk about acting out of love now, doing the best we can now, not knowing what's going to happen, what's possible, and that's okay because of our spiritual practice. We can act in that way. Thank you, Rajesh. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I think we're going to turn it back over to Allison.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, David. Thank you, Rajesh. I love the way you weave together the similarities and some of the differences of your religious traditions, and especially the idea of, be here now, and the idea of embodying the oneness and the hope that we and the earth will survive this time that we're in. So I just want to thank you both so much. This was absolutely a fascinating dialogue. And I also want to thank those of you who joined us, and especially the people who gave us a donation today. That's just very generous and lovely of you, so that we can continue to do our dialogue series. Our next dialogue is going to be on February 24th. That's a Thursday, from 10 to 11 in the morning, Eastern time. And we are going to tackle extractive practices in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. One of those wonderful topics that we need to look at in terms of our devastating our environment. So with that, I want to sign off and thank everyone for this incredible discussion.